the last video, we mentioned a couple of possible solutions to the problem of a negative externality or a positive externality, all right? Those being a Pigouvian tax and a Pigouvian subsidy, respectively, right? But these might not be the easiest solutions to find, or to actually get a good solution. Also, there are other solutions out there. All right, that's what this video is going to focus on. We're going to look at 3 other solutions to the problem of externalities. We're going to focus on negative externalities. So we're going to be looking at solutions to negative externalities. And we're going to have 1 private solution and 2 public solutions. Also, just at the top of this, I'm probably not going to write a whole bunch of stuff down, so you might want to, write down more what I'm saying and not just what I write on the board, because after we get through the first little thing, it's mostly just going to be me talking, which I'm sure you're all thrilled about. All right, so talking about solutions for externalities, right? Ultimately, what we're trying to do when we are formulating solutions to these problems is we are trying to internalize the external costs or benefits. Right? So instead of those costs being external and not felt by the people that are actually in the exchange, we want to internalize those so those costs are a part of the exchange themselves, right? Or at least are impacting the people in the exchange, so that way they take those costs into account when making their decisions about consumption and production. So let's look at our first solution, right? This is going to be the private solution. All right, so the first solution, right, and the private solution that we're going to talk about is what's known as Coase Theorem. All right, so Coase Theorem was developed by an economist named Coase. That's his last name. I think his first name's Ronald. I probably should have looked that up, but I think it's Ronald Coase. Don't quote me on that though. All right, so I was about to say Ronald Coase. I just said I don't know if that's his name. So Coase Theorem states that if transaction costs are low and property rights are well defined, then the market will find the socially optimal level of output, or the socially efficient equilibrium. So there we have it. There is the definition. That's probably the most I'm going to write down. Originally I was going to write down a definition of transaction costs, but I think y'all will be fine if I don't. I'll just tell you, transaction costs are all of the costs associated with completing a trade. All right, so all of the costs associated with completing a trade, that's what those transaction costs are. So this would be anything from, any explicit costs, right, that you have to take on, kind of hiring a lawyer to draft an agreement and have there while you You go through it all the way to implicit costs, like if you have to go stand in some line in a government building to get something to happen, right? That time you spend waiting in line would be part of the transaction costs, all right? But again, if transaction costs are low and property rights are well defined, the market will find that socially efficient equilibrium. So let's first look at this just in an illustration. So let's just illustrate it. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other aspects of it. So probably didn't think I literally meant illustrate it, but here we are. So I'm going to pose a situation to you. All right. There is a factory. All right. This factory is on a river. Right. Downstream of that factory is a farmer who uses the river to irrigate his crops. I'm spending way too much time on this drawing, but that's okay. I think it's going to pay off. All right. Unfortunately for the farmer, factory is polluting the river. Right. They are dumping, some byproducts of their production into the river, and let's assume that it is damaging the farmer's crops. All right, because it's mixed with the water. All right, so now let's see. All right, obviously there's a negative externality here. The farmer doesn't have anything to do with the factory, but is bearing some costs of the transaction between the factory and its consumers. So how do we fix this, right? At this point where we wouldn't expect to be at the socially efficient level of output, right? So how do we get there? All right, one thing I want to note before we get started is that the socially efficient equilibrium does not mean that there is no pollution, right? So we can, and it's almost guaranteed that the socially efficient equilibrium would include some level of pollution, right? Because some types of pollution are going to be very easy to get rid of, right? Very cheap, right? Other types are going to be much more difficult, and if we want to continue using those products, then it's going to be very expensive to get rid of that. So it might not be worth getting rid of that type of pollution, right? But with that said, I digress. All right, so what the Coase Theorem says is that we can assign, and for simplicity's sake, we're going to assume that these are the only two people involved in this, right? So other than the consumers that are getting the good that's produced here, but we're not going to worry about them, right? So the only two people involved in this are the factory and the farmer. So, So Coase Theorem states that if we can define the property rights and the transaction costs are low, then the market will find that socially efficient equilibrium, right, without any intervention. So let's do that, right? We are going to start by, let's say that we assign the property rights, right? And so by in this point, at this case, the property rights would be the right to pollute the river. I don't think that's clear. I bet it's not. PR, property rights, all right? Hopefully y'all can see that. The thing with the big blob over its head, the big red blob, is the one that has the property rights. So we're gonna assign them to the farmer. So the farmer has the property right, the right to pollute the river. So what might be the case, right, is that it might be very expensive for the firm to not pollute that first unit of pollution, right? So let's say that if it's that first unit, if they don't pollute, then they have to, get in a bunch of extra machinery to take care of it and to store it, right? And if you're just got that one level, it's not really worth going and buying that machine or something, right? For whatever reason, right? So if it's very costly, right, for the firm not to pollute, right? And if the cost of one unit of pollution is low for the farmer, right, then the firm, right, may pay, right, the farmer for the right to pollute the river. All right, so the way this might happen is that the firm, the factory says, hey, it costs us, or they might not tell the farmer this, but it costs us this much money to safely keep that stuff in, right? To store it and take care of it, dispose of it in a safe manner, right? That first unit of pollution, it costs us $1,000, right? And the farmer might think to themselves, that first unit of pollution only does $100 worth of damage to my property, right? So if that first unit only does $100 worth of damage, right, and it costs the firm $1,000 to not pollute that first unit, then they may propose some deal and say, hey, we'll pay you up to $1,000, right, to allow us to pollute one unit in this river, all right? And as long as that offer, right, they said, well, I guess it'd be anything from $100 to $1,000, we'll pay that for you to allow us to pollute the river, right? Because in that case, right, if the first unit of pollution only damages the farmer's crops for $100 worth of damage, right, then any amount of money at or above $100, the farmer would be, or I guess at $100, the farmer would be indifferent. Above $100, the farmer would likely give that one unit of pollution to the farmer, right? So this process would continue until we got to the place where the farmer was no longer willing to accept what's offered by the firm to allow them to pollute, right? Or the firm or the factory will not pay the farmer what they're asking for to let them pollute, right? Because at that point, an additional unit of pollution, right, would be more costly than the benefit that the factory could provide to the farmer, right? So again, because let's say the 15th unit the 15th unit of pollution, let's say that would cost the factory $2,000 to keep in, right? And the 15th unit of pollution would cause $2,200 worth of damage to the farmer's crop. Then it would not be worth it for the farmer to sell that good, right? Because the firm would only be willing to pay up to $2,000, the cost of that last unit of pollution, and the farmer would not be willing to accept anything less than $2,200 for the right to pollute that 15th unit. right? But that is the way Coase theorem works, right? Now, the good thing, or the nice thing, honestly, what I want to say is the cool thing. The cool thing about Coase theorem is that it doesn't matter who you assign property rights to, right? So we could assign property rights to the farmer, or we could assign property rights to the factory. Right, and this would only change the situation slightly, right? The only difference is that in this case, if the factory has the factory owner has the property rights, then the farmer would be paying the factory to not pollute, right? They're saying, hey, that last unit of pollution, you know, it's going to cost you this much to do away with it. I'll pay you this much, right? Well, I guess that last example worked. Let's say the 15th unit was the last unit, right? So if it costs the factory $2,000 to pollute, and the damage to, if it costs $2,000 for the factory to not pollute, right, to not pollute that last unit, and the farmer is going to get $2,200 worth of damage to their crops, right, then the farmer would be willing to pay up to $2,200 to the factory not to pollute, right? Again, so kind of giving money, right, so for a guarantee that they're not going to pollute that amount. All right, so that is Coase theorem in a nutshell, right? So if those conditions are met, right, the market can find that socially efficient equilibrium. All right, by kind of going on what's the benefit to me of you not doing this action, right, versus what the cost is to them, right, and negotiating down to where you get to that socially efficient equilibrium. All right, now a problem with Coase theorem are the two conditions, right? If transaction costs are low, right, in some cases transaction costs are low, right? In others, in this little simple scenario we've constructed, I would say transaction costs would probably be pretty low, right? You just go over there and you whoever's handing the money out just hands the money out, and then they're like, okay, we won't, you know, here's a contract, or we won't pollute, or we will pollute, or whatever it is. All right. We also need to be able to define property rights. All right. In this case, since we made it up and we were able to make as many assumptions as we wanted to, we could define those property rights very well. But that's not always the case. All right. It's also not always the case that transaction costs are low. All right. So, for example, all right, I'm just going to steal this from your textbook. Your textbook mentions the flu vaccine several times. All right, they're talking about, you know, could we internalize the costs here, right? So I guess kind of doing the opposite of this one, where we're trying to solve a problem with a positive externality. So so they kind of say, if I don't get a flu shot, right? That has I guess it is a negative externality. Anyway, don't worry about it. All right, so I don't get a flu shot. All right, so there is a negative externality for the people, for everyone else. All right, so if we were trying to do this, you know, what would the property rights be? All right, maybe we could define those, right? Either I have the right not to get vaccinated, or everyone else has the right for me to be vaccinated. It's kind of a weird thing, but if I were to, let's say that we assign the property rights to me, all right? If I have the property rights, then I kind of let this one get away from me. I'll be honest on that one. Let's start that over. I don't like that. the main point is that once you have more people involved in the exchange, the transaction costs are going to go up, as well as the kind of designated property rights is not as easy. Right, so if we're talking about pollution in the real world with the property rights, it's not as easy as just saying, hey, you have the property right to this river, right? Because the river is really long, probably, depending on the river, I suppose, right? There's going to be more than one person negatively impacted if a factory is dumping pollution into that river, right? And so, one, the factory would have to, who has the property right to the river, right? Is it, do you just assign it to the factory? Do you assign it to the farmer? If so, does this farmer have the property right for the entire river? If not, does every person whose property runs up against that river have a property right to the river? Or does it go even further than that, right? Who has those property rights? How do you assign them, right? And then if you could assign them, right, the transaction costs for that would be extraordinary, right? It would be, it'd take a lot for the factory, right, to go and make agreements with every single person that has some kind of property right on this river, right? So this is not really something that we can use very often, if we're just being completely honest. The benefit more so is in just the concept of the theorem, right? If we could assign these property rights, if we could make these transaction costs low, right, we could potentially get here, right? So if we can figure out how to make those two things happen, right, we can take advantage of Coase Theorem, all right? But we do have to have those two conditions in place for it to work. All right. One last thing, I guess I should have mentioned this while I was going over everything. One of the problems with the Pigouvian tax and the Pigouvian subsidy that I mentioned last video is that it's really hard to estimate what those social costs or social benefits are, right? And so setting a tax or setting a subsidy that's going to increase or decrease our equilibrium to the right level is extremely difficult, and you'd only ever be able to get close and never actually land where you're aiming for. Right. One of the nice things about Coase Theorem, even though I kind of already let it out of the bag that it doesn't really work super well in reality, but if we could get it to work, one of the really nice things is that we don't have to worry about how much the social cost is or how much the social benefit is, right? Because individuals will take care of that themselves, right, through that whole kind of negotiation phase, I guess you could call it. Right? They're going to figure out what's socially, what am I willing to give up to get this, right? And they're going to make those decisions on their own, right, reaching that socially efficient equilibrium. But that is Coase Theorem, and that is our private solution. All right, so now let's look at the first of our two public solutions. So this is where we're going to get into me not writing a lot of stuff down. This might literally be the only thing I write down for this entire section. All right, but that being said, let's go ahead and kick off. So with command and control, essentially this is the government saying produce more of this or produce less of this, right? So it's really just the government making an order about how much should be produced. We don't, there's this good that has an external cost. So people are over consuming and overproducing it. So I'm going to tell these producers as the government not to produce as much, right, and limit their production, right? If we've got this good that has a external benefit and we don't think that enough of it is being produced, right, then as the government, I will tell, the people, hey, you got to go consume this good, I guess, all right, because you really have to work on a demand side, so probably it doesn't work that great on that one. But regardless, right, when we're talking about command and control, it sounds very Soviet to me, I guess, or just communist in general, and there's a reason for that, because that's essentially how that works. But because of that, and because of that connection, it has a lot of the same problems that we saw when we were looking at the price system, and we were talking about the socialist calculation problem, all right, or the socialist calculation debate. It's really hard to determine what is going to be the most efficient way to reach your goal, and there are many ways of reaching the same goal, right? And a government is probably not going to have enough information that they need to be able to pick the most efficient way to go about getting their goal. All right. One example, all right, and this is also from your book. So your book talks about how the government was trying to reduce pollution, specifically the pollution caused by, or I guess, maybe not specifically, but including the pollution caused by converting coal into electricity. Right, one of the ways that they did this is they told big brands of big manufacturers of washing machines that they needed to make their products more energy efficient. Right, so the results were a bunch of washing machines that didn't really clean your clothes, all right? Or if you didn't want to take that option, having to pay, I think this was 2007, and they said you had to pay like $900 for a decent washing machine that would actually clean your clothes, right? So the goal of that was to reduce, carbon emissions, right, that were a result of high energy use, high electricity use, right? And the way they did that is questionable how beneficial it was, right? Probably a better way to do it is, well, if the price of electricity increases, consumers will adjust their behavior, right? So instead of just leaving every single light on in my apartment like I normally do, if the price of electricity went up, I might, turn a couple of those lights off, right? I would make my own decisions about where the most valuable uses of electricity were within my own home, right? So instead of going and unplugging my refrigerator, I'd probably start by cutting off some lights. Right, and how can you increase the price of a good? Right, well, one, if you're the government, you can put a tax on it. Right, so a tax on electricity probably would have been, now, politically unfavorable, but probably more efficient. Right, so place a tax. One, it's cheaper than commanding everybody that makes washing machines to make more energy efficient ones. Not just for the government's sake, but also for the companies as well. And also you get tax revenue. So that one seems like a no-brainer, but people would get mad at you, I bet. All right. So a tax on electricity probably would have given us a better result, right? And would have been less costly. Right? We would have, because again, people can make their own decisions about how to conserve energy, right? Reducing those emissions. Right, one place where command and control is desirable is when you aren't looking for flexibility, right? That's one problem with command and control, right? You're just kind of saying, hey, this is what you have to do. There's no flexibility for people, for individuals to make up their own decisions and say, hey, maybe energy efficient washing machine's not high on my list. I'll just, cut the air conditioning off, right? Or if in the summer, put it up a few degrees higher than I normally do. In the winter, set it down a couple of degrees colder than I usually do. All right, save energy in some other way. All right, however, if you're not looking for flexibility, if that's not something that you would necessarily want in the circumstance, and strict compliance to this is required for it to be effective, then command and control can be very, very useful. All right. Your book mentions the eradication of smallpox in the middle of the 20th century as an example. Also kind of very, very topical right now, the coronavirus, right? Command and control had us that's kind of what happened, right? Just come in and shut down sections of the economy, right? Because there was a negative externality for walking around and kind of contacting people, right? We spread the disease much more quickly. It's not the perfect analogy, but again, kind of, it's very rigid, right? Strict compliance with these commands what was necessary to control the outbreak, right? And keep the hospitals from getting overrun. All right, but that's command and control. Again, the government just says, hey, do this. Arguably not very efficient, or in my opinion, and this is my opinion, desirable, except for in maybe very extreme circumstances. All right, the next thing is tradable allowances. All right, so tradable allowances, this is very similar to Coase Theorem. All right, the long and short of it is that with these tradable allowances, all right, these are allowances for pollution, right? The EPA will issue these. These are actually a thing, right? They say here's an allowance for so many allowances. Each allowance is worth 1 ton of carbon emissions, right? And companies can trade those. Right, so one, it says, hey, this is how many you've got. Right, you can't use more than these unless you acquire more. Right, and the way to acquire more is to buy them from other companies. Right, the nice thing about this system is that we are taking these allowances. We're saying, hey, you're still gonna, we're gonna cap you, but you guys can trade these allowances. So if I'm in an industry that is very high value, and that it's worth it for me to buy one of these allowances to continue to make more of my product, right? That's an efficient use. That's an efficient use of pollution, right? If, however, I'm making a product that pollutes and it's not really valuable, then I'm more likely to sell those allowances rather than keep them and use them myself. So again, we've got that Coase Theorem type thing where we have trade, and so that the market can get to what is closer to a socially efficient equilibrium, right? Because high valued things are allocated more allowances through trade than low value goods. All right, so that is essentially it. That is the end of our chapter on externalities. I will see you in the next video.